Hello again, everyone. I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you so much for joining All in Education's second season of Sepas. I'd like to welcome today's experts. We have Jeff Zatino. He is the Research and Policy Director at All in Education. Leticia De La Vara is the Chief of Staff at TNTP. And Dr. Carrie Sampson from ASU is with us. A little bit about All in Education. They are a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Through Sepas, All in Education has been working to bridge their advocacy efforts to be inclusive of multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Now, the focus of Sepas is on having real, thought-provoking conversations with leaders and community members and identifying solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. Now, this season, we will exclusively focus on the issue of poverty, the social determinant of education that, through an analysis, All in Education found was the leading factor that had the greatest negative impact on the welfare of families, communities, students, and schools. So today, the conversation will be exploring a topic that may be a new concept that All in Education is exploring: the lack of access to quality schools. Much like the lack of access to health, nutritious food within the boundaries of a community, the lack of access to quality schools by design, sometimes usually, impacts families and students of color the most. So with that, we welcome Jeff, Leticia, and Dr. Sampson. So Jeff, let's start with you. We've heard from previous episodes, we're talking to Stephanie on the show, not all schools offer the same quality access to resources, extracurricular activities, and it was in the episode description that linked the lack of access to healthy foods, or what have been sometimes described as food deserts. And so can you help us frame how we're going to use that as the foundation of the conversation we're going to be having today?
Yeah, for sure, Eric. Thank you so much. So we wanted to start off the conversation by just uplifting the fact that All in Education really respects and prioritizes language justice. So when we were doing the research for the show, we wanted to liken the lack of access to quality schools to food deserts. So we were going to call this we're going to call the conditions that our students are experiencing high quality school deserts. But upon further research, we saw that nutrition advocates wanted to stay away from the term desert because desert is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And what we see is that food deserts is anything but naturally occurring. It's because of zoning laws, because of structural segregation, because a lot of policy and systemic root causes to these food deserts. So now our food advocates are looking into calling it food apartheid. So it leaves us with a question about, do we call this educational apartheid? Apartheid being a systemic and institutionalized way of segregating disenfranchised minority populations from access to resources. And it's what we're seeing within our research. We're seeing minority students, Black, Indigenous, and students of color being segregated into low quality schools all over Arizona. So is this educational apartheid? Is it a quality school desert? We're left in the position where we really have to grapple with this language and try to determine the terms that we're going to use.
Yeah, you're living up to the title of the show, Thought-Provoking Conversations. So the second part of that is then, can you describe a little bit, maybe even a checklist of what is a quality school as we talk about the lack of quality schools?
Definitely. So as we start thinking about quality schools, I think the question inherent in your question is, who are we defining quality schools for? Now, historically in Arizona, we've used the A through F school letter grading system, but a lot of advocates are saying that it's a little bit too complex, and whenever we give a school a letter graded designation, there's no context behind that grade. So what's going on with a C letter school versus a D or a B letter school? Is it teaching? Is it curriculum? Is it administration? Is it funding? What is it? Our parents are left with that question. So a value that we have in All in Education is being connected to the community. We just finished a series of focus groups and community conversations where we listened to our parents, and what our parents are prioritizing is first and foremost dedicated and trained educators, and that's teachers, principals, administrators, school board officials that are trained and ready to educate our kids. Secondly, parents are talking about a curriculum and high quality curriculum that reflects their culture and their lived experience. Another thing that keeps coming up is schools being at the heart of the community, being a central hub and a connection point to community-based resources. We've talked about the social determinants of education, so parents are looking for connections to social services, mental health services, WIC, access, you name it. And then lastly, we keep hearing from our parents that they want the school to be a welcoming environment, an environment that's filled with transparency and trust. And I think that's something that's really leading us to think about initiatives that spark off shared accountability within every single stakeholder in the school system. And that starts with the parent holding the school board official accountable, because that's who voted them into that position, leading into school board officials working with superintendents, principals, teachers down the line. So the question is, who are we defining quality for?
Yeah, very well said, Jeff. Leticia, Dr. Sampson, thank you both for being here. Leticia, let's start with you. Let's talk a little about your work in the education sector. Tell us a little about that.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Eric, for inviting me today. Leticia de la Vara, I serve as Chief of Staff for TNTP, and I also oversee our policy, advocacy, and community coalition work through the organization. TNTP is a national nonprofit. We've been around for 25 years and have worked with over 300 school systems across 35 states in the U.S., really leaning into how do we actually create opportunities for students to thrive, not just while they're in the classroom, but to have the opportunity to thrive well beyond, to create opportunities to live a life that they dream of, right? And to do that in relation to both the student and the teacher, but also beyond that, to the administrators, to the principals, to the families, and to the communities that they're a part of, because a school does not live, to your point, in isolation, right? It lives within the nexus of a broader community. So thinking through, how do we do that at the school level? How do we do that at the community level? How do we do that at the legislative level? So all students have an opportunity to receive the resources they need for quality education, but also to thrive well beyond their K-12 experience.
And Dr. Sampson, can you talk a little bit about your work over at ASU?
Sure, yeah, thank you first for having me on the show. My work and my teaching and research centers largely on educational leadership and educational equity and policy. I've researched school boards and the way that school board members of color shape districts. I've researched school desegregation, English learner policies, and more recently open enrollment policies. And I'll say that my work as a mother is probably the most relevant here in navigating the system for 2 school-age children who are both Black and Latinx, and that's been a very important piece. You know, I navigated that in their preschool, during the pandemic, and now, and I think that really informs my research here.
So let's advance this conversation a little bit now and talk about, Leticia, in your world, short-term and long-term outcomes when students are faced with the lack of good schools in their community.
Right, yeah. So short term, obviously we know what happens. Kids fall further behind. Academics advance without them. Teachers stop seeing them, let's be honest. They stop seeing them as viable students and start thinking like, let's track them over here. Let's give them easier subjects. So short term, we know that what to remedy. Ensuring that teachers see the full student and don't see skill learning opportunities as deficits, but see them as for what they are, opportunities. Long term though, these students don't exist in a classroom and then that classroom is under-resourced and understaffed and doesn't have what they need just in that 8 to 3 time frame. They go back into a community that also lacks resources, lacks opportunity, doesn't have access to nutrition, and also doesn't have access to what all kids deserve, which is joy. They don't have the opportunity to walk safely in a neighborhood, to play in a park. So there are long-term implications. When we talk about under-resourced and underperforming schools, it goes well beyond that. They're going into communities and families that are trying to figure out how to survive. And that means that we have to think about what that means in the context of education, not to say they're not ready, but to say these are realities. We need to address the realities systemically and to think about them through the whole construct of being in the K-12 system, but also think what are the supports within the community that we need to lean into so we don't create generation after generation of poverty cycles.
And picking up on what Leticia just said there, Jeff, like in your work, what does that do to a student's motivation when the lack of quality schools and joy? We're talking about joy for a student. they don't have joy when they go to school.
Right. Yeah, so basically what are we telling our students, right? When they walk into that classroom and they're confronted with under-resourced schools, underpaid teachers, lack of basic materials to make sure that they're competitive within that classroom space, i.e. a pen and a paper, right? So like, what are we telling them? We're telling them that their education is not important and that their future doesn't matter. So what are we left with? We're left with unmotivated kids that are in the classroom space. How are you going to keep their attention? And we're seeing that in attendance rates. We're seeing school districts with chronic absenteeism rates that's close to about half of their entire student population. So half of a whole district is chronically absent. And we ask ourselves why, but I think the questions are what we're exploring right now, and these are the effects, right? So lack of engagement in the classroom, lower educational attainment, increasing unemployment, increased burden and these systemic factors that we're calling the social determinants of education, which lead to less social cohesion. So we're seeing more violence, we're seeing a deterioration of our communities, and we're even seeing a lack of civic engagement. So this seemingly small piece of the system where we're saying we're underfunding a school has huge ramifications across the community. And as we know, education is at the heart of the American experience, and we're starving kids of education.
So let's start talking about the response. And Dr. Sampson, in your work at ASU, what are some of the interventions that you have found that are, maybe helping to solve or alleviate some of this problem?
I mean, of course, one thing I want to kind of pull back on, I'm really glad that you're teasing out what is school quality. How are we defining school quality? And in Arizona, a lot of us use this rating system, A through F, and which is largely determined by test scores, proficiency, growth, etc. But does that really mean that our kids, even in an A-rated school, are going to feel affirmed? And so I lived in a neighborhood in a suburb of Phoenix, and my neighborhood school was an A-rated school. It was right around. I could walk my kids to that school. It was 1% Black and African American students in that school. And from the parents I spoke with, the Black parents I spoke with, they told me stories of their kids being harassed and called the N-word. And so of course my concern of sending my kids to this neighborhood school that is A-rated and very popular, there was a waiting list for this school. I went into the school, I spoke with the teachers and the staff. There was not one teacher that was Black or brown. When I brought up these concerns about what I had heard, they were dismissed, outright. And there was no way I felt like I could send my kid to that school and not have her spirit be, busted in that environment. And so, in part, we moved to Central Phoenix to look for more diverse schools. And so now my neighborhood, the school that's closest to me, is a C-rated school. But it is a dual language school. I walk into that school and there's lots of, not lots, but at least several more teachers of color and staff of color in that school. My kids feel affirmed in that school. And on the other end, though, they are struggling. It's a struggle academically. They're overcrowded classrooms. So, that's one intervention, right? How do we recruit and retain more teachers? How do we get more funding to decrease class sizes? How do we institute innovative programs that will engage our kids? I think what you were saying about culturally relevant curriculum is super important in pedagogy, and this is what families are saying. This is what research is saying, and we have very clear research that have come out of even Arizona with the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, but even in California, who has recently instituted an ethnic studies requirement that makes a difference for a lot of our kids, and not just our Black and brown kids, white kids, academically are doing better and are more engaged when they have curriculum that is reflective of all cultures. And so I think that is, one, and I think it's a challenge here, of course, for various reasons. And a lot of my work looks at systems, and I can probably get into this open enrollment system, which is a really complex environment here. We are in a hyper school choice environment, 30 years of hyper school choice, where our kids can go to any district, any school in any district, and now even more so with a voucher system. And so what is that going to mean for funding in the coming years in our public schools and our neighborhood schools, and who has access to quality, well-funded schools? You know, not only schools that are affirming and reflective of their communities, but are, you know, adequately funded and that are addressing our kids in a very holistic manner.
You brought up one of the biggest pieces of this, and it's teacher recruitment and retention. Leticia, in your work, what are some of the ways that we can be improving teacher recruitment and retention?
That is a big piece, and the story that Dr. Sampson tells about A-rated schools still not thinking about how all students are received into their classroom is something that, you know, is not unique. It is actually systemic across all of the country. Our teaching staff across the country does not at all look like the shifts that the country has made over the last few decades. And that's a problem. That's a problem for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, though, is that students aren't seen fully for who they are. And we're missing an opportunity to stay relevant in a global market by acknowledging our country is diverse. That means our education needs to be more diverse. Our teachers need to be more diverse. So when they come into a classroom, they see the full assets of the students in front of them. They see the full opportunities, and they see that as a long-term approach. Some of the ways that we are thinking about this is we know teachers don't go in saying, I don't see a full child, right? They want to be better. So we do this through a variety of different ways. A few of the different ways that we've been looking at this, though, is through our partnership with All in Ed. We've done a Parent Educator Academy in partnership with All in Ed and TNTP to really understand how does a parent become more engaged, and how does a parent become a better advocate to work in partnership with the teacher rather than someone who just shows up for a parent-teacher conference. And not only how do they become better, but how does the teacher in the system see them as fully engaged into that system and seeing the value of an education system. We've partnered in New Mexico through an Indigenous education initiative to bring in the Pueblo communities to talk about the traditions and practices from a lens of academic and science and reading perspectives. So we're tying curriculum to cultural experiences that exist that should be valued and should be known about across generations. We have, specifically at TNTP, we have what we call a Black Educator Excellence Cohort, so that new teachers are not feeling, and this is true across the country, you're not feeling like, I am the only Black teacher, I am the only brown teacher in this space, I'm the one that they call for discipline issues, I'm the one that they call for translation for the whole school. How do we create networks so teachers don't feel defeated when they walk in? Because it can't just be like we say these systems are broken and we leave teachers without. What we need to do is create resources through trainings, create resources through peer-to-peer networks. So we're expanding the opportunities to get there and doing it not just at the teacher level or at the student level, but doing it all the way through, from principals to administrators to systems, university systems. How do they look at the next crop of teachers, and are they truly reflecting who this country is now? I think it's by 2030, 1 in 5 workers will be Latino. Has our career system for teachers actually tracked that to think about, are we really recruiting the next workforce, or are we using the old system and expecting different results? We have to talk to young professionals in a different way. They are the folks who will think about students and think about how to grow this education pipeline in a different way that respects students, because they understand what it feels like to see a teacher in front of them who doesn't connect with them, who dismisses their cultural experience, and who doesn't see their parents as valued and trusted leaders. We need to understand that our country is different, and that's okay. It's nothing to be afraid of. But let's also tap into, are we preparing the next round of teachers to embrace that as well? And are we preparing the principals and administrators? And when I say we, I do mean the collective we. It's not on a superintendent to solve this by themselves. It is us as community stakeholders, as community leaders. It is us as elected officials saying we will invest in this for the long term. We are not looking for quick solutions.
I was going to ask you about effective strategies, and you mentioned one of their on just community partnerships, but anything else that you're seeing that is like repeatable, effective today?
Yeah, definitely. We have a lot of different frames and networks that we've used across the country, but it is having a holistic approach. It is not just here's a great classroom design, here's a great curriculum to use. It is how do you engage peer-to-peer? How do you coach and see, here's what I saw in your classroom, but also how do you provide resources so teachers aren't in there by themselves trying to figure out how to be effective. So it is understanding resources that teachers need, understanding how principals and administrators actually play a key role in retaining quality teachers. So that they want to be in a system that sees their full values just as much as we talk about kids' full values. We see teachers of color in their full value and see them as assets who have more to give and create career pathways for them. So they want to come back into the communities who nurtured them, who got them the success that they have. And so learning how to provide those resources at full scale is an opportunity.
Well, the way we wrap up these conversations, we love to do this, is we kind of go around the room a little bit and get a call to action for community leaders. And Dr. Sampson, we'll start with you. Hearing everything we talked about today, what would be your call to action for community leaders who have influence in creating some of the changes that we were just talking about?
I mean, I think what my colleagues here talked about are great. I mean, you hit on so many important points. I mean, one of the things that my research at a high level is looking at here in Arizona is, like I said, open enrollment policies and what that does systemically. And I think it's important that we kind of step back and say, what has happened 30 years now, and what are the unintended consequences, perhaps, maybe intended, of some of these policies, right? And I think we see, particularly in our urban core, many of our school districts are feeling the high impact of declining enrollments. They're facing school closures. There's so much competition from district to district. We have some of our suburban schools busing kids out of some of our lower rated schools, and that's making them and putting them in a position where they're even more underfunded. And then those students are getting pushed out because of disproportionate discipline practices. And so it's a really interesting system that we've been following. And some of the premier schools in the urban core are pulling in families from like Scottsdale. So we have a district that serves 95% students of color. And this particular premier school has 30% white students, and 77% of those students are coming in from out of the district. And so we went in that neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood right near here. We knocked on doors and said, "Oh, are you, what's going on?" These families. We asked them, "Are you interested in going to the school across the street?" And they all had these stories about how they tried to get into this premier school, and they were on the waiting list and never got in. And instead, they're being bussed out to other schools. And we realized and we learned that unless you had your kid in at 3 years old in this preschool, there was hardly any way that you would nearly impossible to get into this premier school, this A-rated, like in a low-income neighborhood. And so even when there's these like quality schools in the neighborhood, families are struggling to access it because of this system. That's really complicated and hard to navigate. I mean, how many families knew that there was even a preschool there? They didn't. I mean, we informed them at that moment, but can you imagine what that means for this whole neighborhood that now has to go somewhere else? And we spoke to a father who has no car. So he said, well, when I have to go get my kid early, I have to get on the city bus, even though there's a school right across the street, I have to get on a city bus to get to my kid. And he said, I think that's like more of a white school. We can't go there, even though it's their neighborhood school, a public school. And so these systems, I think we need to step back and reevaluate what it is that we're, calling quality schools and who has access to these schools, even in our neighborhoods.
So reevaluating the systems there. Leticia, what about you? Call to action for community leaders.
Yeah. So it's a big one. But I also think I love the concept of Paque Sepas and talking through all these issues, but I also want to make sure that we don't forget some of the answers may be right in front of our faces. We have a teacher gap, right? A teacher talent pipeline gap. Like we know folks are exiting, we know we don't have enough to come into the classroom, and staffing shortages are always real. We have parents and paraprofessionals who have always been committed to education, who have always wanted what's best for children and have always been there. We need to think about them as that potential teacher pipeline. We should realize the assets that exist within our communities and tap into them. They have always been there. Families will always believe in the school that takes care of their child. And so we should tap into that. We have performance gaps. We have community leaders who have been around the school system for years. We need to tap into these advocates who truly care about what goes on in the community and see them as collaborators versus just folks on the outside. We cannot solve educational issues in one classroom. We cannot solve it with just the 4 people on these sofas. We will do it only in partnership with others and thinking across sectors to do it. But I also want to make sure that we don't look at this as just an issue for schools that are in poverty. We've talked a lot about the high performing schools. I have news for folks who are in high performing schools. Their kids aren't ready for college either. And that's a huge myth that we never talk about. So you may think, I'm going to move my kid into the white school or the A grade school. Those kids, I've heard from parents just the same. Like, they graduated with all A's, they go into college, they're in remedial classes. We're trying to figure out how to get, so there is this myth that it's just poor schools. We as a collective community should be looking at all of our schools, and A does not mean preparation. And we need to make sure we're preparing our kids for the future so that they can thrive, so that they can have the economic and social mobility they deserve.
Great outlook there, Jeff. I'll let you close us out. Your call to action. I love how you started this conversation, and now you can kind of help us end it here.
I don't think that there's an end to this conversation, unfortunately, but I love the conversation that we had. One of our PEA participants actually just got hired to be a teacher assistant. So she started off just as a mom that was, engaged with her child's education, and now she's working for our education system. And I think that's a testament to looking at our community as assets and not as people or things to be fixed. Another little vignette, in a previous position, I was working with affordable housing, and affordable housing parents going into our local school, and they would always complain about the front office. And they would always say how they never hear us, they're always mean to us, there's always a lot of disrespect. And then now working on the other side with system leaders and teachers and principals and administrators, it's almost like there's a separation due to guilt and stigma. I think teachers, front office administrators, front office staff, I think we all understand the huge challenge that's in front of us, and I think that we're all guilty because we can't deliver the education that our kids deserve. But I think that once we're able to tear those walls down and really start working alongside each other, like I started with, we're toying around with this concept around shared accountability and shared responsibility, and it shouldn't be bad words. We should all understand that we're in it together and that we have to work at improving systems that might be imperfect, but we have to address their imperfectness right now in order to make them better.
Man, such a great conversation. We thank you so much for joining us for this edition of All in Education's PACE Sepas, the social determinants of education. As a reminder, we will continue building on this conversation. As Jeff just said, it doesn't end here. Every month bringing you a deep dive conversation around each of these topics. Thank you so much, Jeff, Leticia, Dr. Sampson, for sharing your knowledge on this topic. And Jeff, I know you want to thank the Garcia Family Foundation for supporting the show.
Yeah, huge thank you for the Garcia Foundation for allowing us to bring these conversations to light. It's been a whirlwind of opportunity and conversations and thought-provoking comments and guests. So thank you so much for the Garcia family.
And make sure you tune in next month as we take a look at what makes a quality school and what is needed to ensure every student has access to one. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.